Hello, welcome to Am I Neurodivergent, chapter 35 of 52. This is the second of 4 videos. I'm doing recapping King's College London's 4-week Understanding ADHD course available on the FutureLearn website, which is linked to in the description. For anyone coming to this as my first video, I'm Struan. I found out I was neurodivergent, both autistic and ADHD, over the last couple of years, and these videos are recapping that discovery year and finding out about the new me, or the me that had always been, week by week from a complete standing start. As well as a link to the FutureLearn course. I'll also put links to both ADHD and Autism Self-Tests in the video description text if you're interested in looking into either of those more. These 4 understanding ADHD videos are basically me recapping my course notes and personal reflections from taking this course around 8 months into my discovery year after various experts spotted I had significant ADHD presentations on top of my autism diagnosis, which I'd already had for a few months at this point, but I hadn't yet got a formal ADHD diagnosis too. I was just on a learning journey to find out more. Co-occurring ADHD and autism are way more common than people have realised. It's rapidly turning out. Just to keep reiterating, it's a presentation increasingly known as ADHD, but these few videos are specifically on the ADHD aspect of that spicy double combo deal. So the second week of the Understanding ADHD course is all about, quote, the lived experience of ADHD from multiple perspectives, which sounds great in theory. We're all about the lived experiences when we're living with the experiences, right? But look, I'm just going to say up front about this video, having been through and reviewed all my study notes from week 2 of this course now, I personally do not like this course as much as the 4-week Understanding Autism course. I kind of gushed over in chapters 21 to 24 of my channel, and I'll explain why. I didn't notice this at the time I initially did the course. I was just interested in finding out more about ADHD, but looking back on it now, the vast majority of the case studies and people consulted about lived experiences of ADHD are not people with ADHD. They're people with lived experiences of people with ADHD from non-ADHD people, whether that's parents of ADHD kids or teachers or psychiatrists or GPs. It's only towards the end of the week 2 modules we finally hear from people who have ADHD themselves, and that really irked me when I reviewed the course, particularly in comparison to the Understanding Autism course I did previously, in which actually autistic voices and autistic academics are integral to formulating that understanding. Actually, ADHD people seem almost like a tokenistic bolt-on to helping non-ADHD people understand ADHD here, and it just really bothered me. Anyway, having said all that, I'm still going to press on using these course notes as the basis for this little ADHD mini-series within my own series. A, because I'm doing that whole week-by-week recap of my discovery year, and this course is what I was doing and thinking about at this point in the journey. And B, because the information's still fundamentally useful, even if the way it's been presented I find slightly discordant in retrospect. To be fair, the blurb at the start of the course does say it's for health and education professionals to help them understand ADHD, as well as for people personally affected by ADHD themselves. And teaching the non-ADHD people that we as ADHDers often have to rely on, who are often ignorant as shit, is no bad thing. So I'm not going to be too salty about or labour this whole thing of minimising ADHD voices in an Understanding ADHD course, other than to say I hope future versions of courses like these have a better balance of voices than this one. But I will throw in a bit of my own and others' lived experiences of actually being ADHD towards the end of this to counterbalance a bit of the this is what it's like for normal people to have to experience and handle the strangeness of ADHDers narrative that just occasionally comes through in these modules, a narrative which can do a run and jump for most of us, obviously. Anyway, all those caveats aside, there are a number of case studies and personal experiences highlighted during week 2, the first of which were primarily around kids and parents of kids, but it's useful reading this stuff for late diagnosed people too. So, for example, Shelley, the mum of a boy with ADHD, who was described as a little wild in his younger days, she got shunned by other parents for not being able to control her kid. How the messaging that she just needed to be a stricter parent was reiterated by their doctor. Jesus wept. How his early schooling affected his well-being. How a well-informed SEN, which is special educational needs, teacher finally picked up on likely ADHD, and that none of his disruptive behaviour had any malice behind it. Just that he struggled to sit still, that he was easily distracted, that he needed to hear instructions more than once before processing them, that he'd started to feel bad that he was seen as different, and his self-esteem took a total nosedive, eventually leading to intervention, a move to a new, more inclusive school where he was treated as an individual, nurtured, educated in ways that worked for him, and led to a complete turnaround in his experience. Another case study is Stuart, the adoptive dad of James, who was another kid with ADHD, and how difficult it can be to parse ADHD from other behavioural issues, particularly with kids in the care system with adverse or traumatic backstories, as well as other conditions that may be co-occurring. So James is described as a busy kid with a very low boredom threshold who would only play with toys for a minute or less before jumping from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. This behaviour will not necessarily be the case if you're autistic as well as ADHD, by the way. The two conditions mix in unpredictable ways, and you can obsess over toys for years with ASD. But for James, this flitting from thing to thing was initially identified by experts as an anxiety attachment issue. And Stuart talks about the difficulty in eventually getting an ADHD diagnosis, as paediatricians seemed weirdly resistant to going down that route. And he felt they had almost a confirmation bias, looking for attachment issues and trauma and matching aspects of what they were seeing to their initial assumptions that it must be that, because that's what traumatized kids in the care system have. You can basically get gaslit by services because of both unconscious bias and just by lack of awareness of ADHD. This has clearly happened to so many others who were missed, whether in the care system or not. Stuart's also described as a really bright kid despite his difficulties on focusing, and it eventually turned out, as well as ADHD, he was also autistic. He struggled badly with transitions and had sensory processing issues, so struggled to settle in school settings, started lashing out, it says, en route to being excluded for being disruptive, until the adoptive parents made the decision to homeschool him while they looked for more inclusive education settings, and got him into the CAMS system, which is Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services here in the UK, and worked on seeing how he responded to different ADHD meds and finding combinations that worked for him. An adoptive mum talks about how much they had to do to push the system forward themselves to get their kid the help he needed. Again, as so often seems to be the case, you have to push and self-advocate to get the results you need, which should not be the case, because often the people who need help the most are those less likely to have the wherewithal to push and self-advocate. But here we are. She also talked about how shocked she was that no one in all the expert settings they dealt with, from the local education authority to the educational psychologist they dealt with to the special educational needs coordinator to teachers, were remotely joined up or even initially suggested ADHD as a possibility. Because now that they have the diagnosis for their son and understand it, it seems like the most obvious and intuitive thing in the world. But it's not seen by so many of those who don't get it and don't properly understand it. She also talks about her frustration with politicians and policymakers not giving enough attention to early identification and support, and says to parents, never assume that the quote-unquote experts know more than those with lived experience. They don't. Trust your instincts, trust your intuition, and fight for the support you or your loved ones need. Stuart, the dad who spoke previously, also talks about how having a label is not a negative. as a lot of people frame a diagnosis, like particularly because they now know he's not his previous label of kind of naughty, disruptive, peculiar kid. It's like I said in one of my previous videos, getting a neurodivergent diagnosis doesn't put you in a box. It allows you to step out of a box. And for me, there needs to be an absolute paradigm shift in understanding this one key point about neurodivergence. From here, the course modules talk to a head teacher about teaching ADHD kids. He talks about his 4 factors he works to of openness, so kind of listening to teachers when they talk about inattention or hyperactivity or impulsiveness, as well as parents raising concerns. Proactivity, so coordinating CAMs, SENCOs, parents and GP support, for example, not just leaving issues that need to be dealt with holistically for others to sort out. Supportiveness, so dealing with the individual student and the student's family's needs first and foremost over labels and diagnoses, as well as supporting staff with resources and additional support for them. And finally, culture in terms of leading change from the top, which all sounds like good stuff if it actually happens. Teacher training for neurodiversity, that head teacher concludes, is still not comprehensive enough, and ADHD management in particular is a really complex area, and just sanctioning kids for bad or disruptive or inattentive behaviour is clearly not the answer. It's about supporting emotional and learning needs using targeted academic support to close any gaps in learning styles and working with the child or student to get the best out of them, not against them. For example, letting a kid draw or stim while listening if it helps them concentrate, and staying in close contact with parents, as kids will often behave quite differently at school than they do at home, and being aware of things like a 2E profile that I've mentioned previously as well. I'll put some links to that again in the description. 2E is like where kids are neurodivergent but also considerably above average intelligence and will often get good grades, not be disruptive, but have a really damaging internal dialogue about being and feeling different, and high levels of anxiety, which is really hard to spot, and one of the most likely groupings of neurodivergent kids to be missed by the system and then just left to drown a bit on their own as they get older without really knowing or understanding why. Hello to every late diagnosed ADHDer watching, basically. Next we get Colin Woodcock, an educational psychologist from the University of Southampton, who finally celebrates the growing narrative that neurodiversity is a brain difference, not a brain disorder, and that there are considerable advantages to having neurodivergent brain wiring, in addition to the disadvantages and challenges laid down by the so-called medical model of regarding anything out of the ordinary as an abnormality. He describes people with ADHD as dynamic, curious, imaginative, and great at task switching. Those traits may not gel wonderfully with the demands of the modern day classroom and its structured approach to learning, but that doesn't mean there's a problem with the brains themselves, just that ADHD plus environment equals outcome. Different environment, different outcome. And lots of people, he points out, simply learn new skills by doing them and learn from seeing immediate results. And that approach to learning has existed long before structured classroom environments have. Maybe, and here's a shocking concept, when something's not working, change the environment, not the child. This was great and made me sad that we don't hear more of these types of voices, and also sad that there are massive shortages in the numbers of enlightened educational psychologists around to advise educational establishments on practices that don't damage huge numbers of kids. I'm just going to skim through the next few modules, as there's more case studies from support workers who work with families, psychiatrists on how they diagnose and treat ADHD, which was interesting. They really extol the virtues of meds where just ADHD is present, but that not all kids presenting with ADHD symptoms like impulsivity, distractibility, and problems with attention will necessarily have a neurodevelopmental condition, which is true, that often those ADHD-like symptoms could be the product of neglect or attachment difficulties or learning difficulties or depression or anxiety or significant overlap with other neurodevelopmental conditions like autism or sensory processing, and that often ADHD occurs concurrently with those other things, and that separating the two out can be really complex, and that just prescribing meds when you spot some ADHD-like symptoms can be quite a lazy way of dealing with more complex ADHD and wider neurodiversity, which is true. And just to insert my own take here, because that take on not being lazy and prescribing meds is really valid, but I don't want to minimize the other side of that and the huge benefits of ADHD meds in the right circumstances either. I know there's a sizable element of the neurodiverse community who see all meds as the devil's work, and that people's brains are beautiful just the way they are, and that brain chemistry should not be tampered with. And I kind of get that perspective, particularly where there's more, or likely more than just ADHD at play. But there's always two sides to any story, and what's right for one person won't always be right for another. And that's why all this stuff has to be so nuanced and not cookie cutter. Like, this is what you do for these people. I've been experimenting with ADHD meds on and off myself these last few months, and I'll do a separate video on that. There have been both pros and cons of that for me, but for many, many people with ADHD, taking meds is a huge boost to how they feel about themselves and how they function effectively in the world. I 100% agree it's not and should not be the default answer for everyone, particularly when there are co-occurring conditions, but it's all about experimentation and patience and self-awareness, which is sometimes really challenging for us, particularly when you come to medicating those differences later in life. So yeah, I just wanted that kind of balanced point on meds there. The second psychiatrist they spoke with, not the great educational psychiatrist I mentioned, the second one, he gets really stuck on talking about impairments and disability, which is really quite disheartening. And this is where the course kind of lost me a bit in terms of me having universal goodwill towards it, because there's far too much unchallenged medical model and neurotypical perspectives about how to manage ADHD as if it's a flaw, as opposed, like I mentioned at the start, to the Understanding Autism course of the same on the same platform, which was heavily influenced by autistic people, and I would wholeheartedly recommend. This one, it's interesting, but I'd be far more inclined to recommend something like the Inflow ADHD app with its learning modules than this course, or binge watching Jess McCabe's How to ADHD video channel. I'll put links to both of them in the description as well, on the off chance people aren't aware of either, because they're both absolutely brilliant ADHD resources. But anyway, like I said, this is me recapping my learning journey, and this is what I was learning about ADHD 8 months into my discovery year. We've a lot further to go on all this stuff. Anyway, next we get a GP's perspective and role in referrals for ADHD assessments as a case study. And honestly, I was starting to get a bit pissed off with essentially all of these lived experience case studies being broadly about the lived experiences of neurotypical people dealing with and handling people with ADHD, not the lived experiences of people with ADHD. I'm repeating myself. It's kind of weird to think, like, given that ADHD is way more common than autism, that understanding ADHD seems to be even less well embedded in some ways than understanding autism, particularly in the quote-unquote system, where that understanding and empathy is most needed. But here we are. Just not enough time, money, or knowledge in the system. Next module was from teachers' perspectives and how teachers' experience of working with kids with ADHD shaped their beliefs about ADHD. I was just feeling pretty deflated at this point, going back through all of these, with professional educators still believing in studies conducted in the last decade that ADHD is the result of environmental factors, learned behaviours, lack of structure, no boundaries, with much lower understanding of any actual neuroscience or neurodivergent heritability, or the fact ADHD, like other neurodivergent conditions, is a lifelong condition, not just a kid's issue. Like, yeah, really disheartening module, this one. The broad conclusions to all of these are assume complexity when dealing with people with ADHD, because it's rarely been a straightforward road or lived experience for them. Another overriding common factor is stigma, prejudice, and misinformation about what ADHD is. We're getting better in this area, particularly recognizing the inattentiveness subtype of ADHD better, not just the hyperactive, impulsive, but there's still some distance left to run. On school experiences in particular, the main issue is differentiating the learning and classroom needs and experience of neurotypical and neurodivergent kids, and just how different those learning styles can be, and how difficult and deflating and non-inclusive quote-unquote standard schooling can be for ADHD kids. I don't personally know whether the answer is splitting neurotypical and neurodivergent learning up, but I know I would have found my own education a hell of a lot more conducive if we'd been able to move around and to task switch to whatever information our brains were interested in soaking up at any given moment. Like, throw in my autistic need to learn things chronologically too, and school was really not great for my learning preferences, which were all broadly formed later on. But I also accept the disruption all of that would cause to more typical learning styles and focused working, and can only conclude at this stage that these are really tricky questions going forward. Finally, at the back end of all the week 2 lived experience modules, we finally get on to the lived experience of Catherine, the late diagnosed ADHD mum we met in week 1 of the course. And Catherine talks more about the stigma around ADHD for adult diagnosed ADHDers, and reiterates how fundamentally most people just do not understand what ADHD is. She talks about why so many adults are now self-referring because of institutional ignorance within the system in being able to recognize adult ADHD, at least here in the UK. People self-refer because GPs don't spot ADHD or pick it up. Therapists don't spot or pick it up. Psychiatrists don't spot it or pick it up. So it's left to individuals to self-diagnose, pick up the pieces of an at best wildly inconsistent, at worst woefully incompetent system, and find themselves specialist help or pay to go private to actually work out what's going on with them. And it's pretty damn tragic that this is still the situation we're in. So Catherine sets out that she did not ask her GP to refer her to an ADHD specialist. She instructed her GP to refer her to an ADHD specialist. And the GP said, "You don't look like you have ADHD," like how many of us will have heard that. And she had to present more and more evidence and insist over and over again and discuss getting a private diagnosis if the NHS system was going to fail her. She did end up waiting for and getting an NHS assessment herself, but she got her kids assessed privately because the system was failing them too, particularly her daughter, who was bright and masking and wanted badly to conform and fit in, but was struggling really badly to do so. And the teachers weren't spotting it, just saying, "She doesn't focus enough," which sounds very familiar to the consistent and recurring feedback I got from my childhood and teens school reports. So because her daughter's teachers didn't see what she as a parent saw, and didn't listen to the fact that both of the girls' parents had now had adult ADHD diagnoses, the system just wouldn't progress her daughter's diagnosis. And they had to go private, at which point people knew what they were doing and what to look for and knew the right questions to ask. And the girl got a diagnosis almost straight away. And they finally started making some progress as a family. Stuff like this just makes me want to scream. It really does. And it still happens time after time after time. Catherine also talks a little about stigma from her own wider family, who also didn't understand ADHD and just felt like it didn't apply to her. She wants the discussion to change from primarily focused around labels and diagnosis to just differences, don't we all? And that those differences can contribute to great things if cultivated properly. She touches on the fact that ADHD brains have created and do create wonderful things many times over. And that's another video I'm going to do before wrapping up this series. Just look at all the fantastic ADHD brains in music and the arts, for example. Yes, having a diagnosis is empowering, she says. Having the knowledge that your brain is a certain way is empowering, but the conversation should be about neurotypical brains and neurodivergent brains and how those two thinking styles work together to elevate both. And I could not agree more with that conclusion. I talked a bit about it in my chapter 20 postcard from the future video, and I'm going to come back to it again in a more considered way before I wrap up this series, because it's really important. There's a brief final bit in week 2 about the concept of what was briefly referred to as adult onset ADHD symptoms, which became a thing for a while and confused the landscape a bit. The context of it was a reaction to another thing that was wrong, but was considered gospel for a long time. So in the 1950s, in a paper about ADHD in the journal Pediatrics, ADHD was very much seen as a childhood disorder, and the paper sets out that, quote, "In later years, this syndrome tends to wane spontaneously and disappear. We have not seen it persist in those patients we have followed to adult life." End quote. This is wrong. And in last week's video, I looked a bit more at that. But that was the context of the pendulum swinging back the other way, that ADHD could also suddenly emerge in adulthood. And while the course itself leaves that as an ongoing open-ended question, for me, with lived experience of ADHD, that's also wrong, and clearly wrong, and the broad consensus now agrees with that. Although I didn't know I had ADHD until adulthood, for me it 100% did not show up in adulthood. It was just diagnosed in adulthood. In my videos I did about my childhood and teens, I read out teacher comments from some of my old school reports about inability to stay focused, getting distracted, difficulty organising myself, acting up, not living up to my potential. The ADHD symptoms didn't show up in adulthood, they were always there, just no one knew what they were looking for. When the adult environment you're in becomes increasingly less conducive, you become increasingly more challenged. You forget altogether about thriving and concentrate on just surviving. Like, welcome to the party, so-called adult onset ADHD. You were always there, being coped with and squashed down until you couldn't be anymore. I've done enough of my own lived experience, probably to the point of excess in the last few videos I did before looking at this ADHD course. But in terms of ADHD specifically, just to redress the balance a little more of most of this week's modules recap, I wrote this down in my notes. And I don't know whether they were my thoughts, they do sound like them, or whether I cribbed them from somewhere. But if the latter, please do flag, and I will gladly give credit. But basically, hang on. When you're an ADHDer, you just feel different from other kids from a very early age. When you're a relatively bright ADHDer, you can probably coast through primary school with minimal effort and do well there. It will start to get gradually tougher in secondary school. You'll find consistent working difficult, but still probably be able to skate by pulling last-minute all-nighters, because impending deadlines create adrenaline and cortisol to make up for your dopamine motivation deficiencies. If you get to university, you'll probably struggle because of the lack of structure, and if you get to a master's, it may take you years or never happen at all due to multiple deferrals and pauses and dropouts. Much of the aspects and projects of your life probably feel started but incomplete. You'll probably try multiple jobs, start them with enthusiasm, then run out of steam. Leave bills unpaid, feel distracted, have difficulties with sequential processing, find yourself frequently zoning out, not really listening, thinking about something else, have difficulty starting or sustaining relationships, mood swings and emotional dysregulation, anxiety and depression, maybe find that antidepressants make you worse if you try them because serotonin has an adverse effect on dopamine. You may feel super creative, sensitive, a perfectionist. You might routinely overspend your finances, fidget, feel always tired, swing from boisterousness to withdrawn, lose stuff, be impulsive, irritable, easily frustrated, feel wired, feel weird, can't finish anything, get bored, always late, have insomnia, be overly talkative, then crash and have nothing, be forgetful, contrary, miss important information, feel anxious, be pushy to get your way, and frequently seem to upset others. This is a lived ADHD experience. I'll finish with two things I definitely did swipe in my ADHD notes, the first of which is a quote from Jesse J. Anderson, which is, ADHD feels like you're never doing what you're supposed to be doing, so no matter how productive you are, it feels like not enough. And the second is a quote from Jess McCabe's fantastic TED Talk, Failing at Normal, which again I'll link to, which is, ADHD is not fidgety people that can't focus and are lazy. It's people with brains that are chronically under-aroused. It's having an executive function deficit that makes it hard to get started with things, and it's struggling to keep up with a society that's not set up for your neurotype. You are not broken, you are not weird, you are not stupid. You're different, you're beautiful, and you're not alone. Welcome to the tribe. End quote. Jess McCabe is just great. So yeah, sharing stuff like this is what Lived Experience Week should be. King's College London, for future reference, not psychiatrists and teachers talking about deficits and impairments. Anyway, week 2 of this course did annoy me a little looking back, but I'm going to stick with doing these recaps and completing this little ADHD mini-series for my own channel. Yeah. So share this, subscribe to alerts, all that stuff, and let's see what week 3 of the ADHD course brings next time. Cheers for watching, and yeah, just about still Happy New Year. Cheers.